Hi knitting friends, Shaina Bilow here. In this video, I'm going to show you how to seam together Jill's first sweater. Skip ahead to the section you need and pause when you have to. We're going to begin by seaming the shoulders, and I want to talk about the supplies you'll need for that. I have in my hands here a contrasting color yarn, and I'm actually going to use that for the seaming. The reason I use a contrast color yarn is so that you can see it, but also because sometimes our knitting yarns are not meant to be seamed with. They're not strong enough. So you'll notice I picked a color here that's about the same shade as my sweater in terms of color depth, and it actually matches some of the tweeds that you see in the sweater. So it will hide within the seam. Pick a color of a thinner, smooth, strong yarn that will match something in your sweater. The other thing that I've got for seaming is a bent tip tapestry needle. I like the bent tip because the mattress stitch requires a lot of shoveling. You're going to be picking up stitches, so it's nice to have that bent tip for that. So let's begin. We're going to start with about 3 times the width of one shoulder seam for our finishing yarn. And you'll notice I've got the outsides of my sweater facing me. They're laying flat on the table in front of me, and the outsides are facing. So this is the inside of my sweater. This is the outside. As I seam, I don't want surprises. I want to know what my piece will look like when it's finished. On the bottom, on the lower half, we're going to be picking up the stitch that points up, that looks like a little letter A. That's just below the bound off edge. So if you want to take a moment and just find a little letter A on the bottom edge, and then on the top edge, just above the bound off, we're looking for a little letter V. So on the bottom we're picking up A's, on the top we're going to pick up V's. All right. So we're starting here from right to left, and on the bottom piece I'm going to pick up just the right side of the very first A and dive my needle through it. So this is how I'm starting off the seam. On the top side, I'm going to pick up the very first V. So my needle comes from on top of the fabric, dives under the stitch, and then pops up. And then I bring that through. I'm going to leave about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters of yarn in between each of my stitches. After I've picked up the V on top, I'm now going to go and pick up that second half of the A that we had skipped before, the one just on the edge. So my yarn's coming out here, I dive in and scoop up an A. I come back to the other side, on top now. My needle is going to dive into the same hole that the yarn is coming out of, and I'm going to scoop up the very next V. Then I come to the bottom, I dive in the same hole the yarn is coming out of, and I scoop up the very next A. And you're going to repeat this. So as long as you're not going backwards and not skipping anything, you're in good shape. What we want to do is make sure we pick up every single A from the bottom and every single V from the top, one after the other. A and V. A and V. And we're repeating that until we get to the end. Now you'll notice I've kept this pretty loose here. You can see all of my stitches coming together. What I do is every 1.5 inches, 2 inches of stitching, I then pull tight and hide the yarn. So you can see that my finishing yarn has now disappeared. This is what the seam looks like on the back of the work. After I've pulled that yarn tight, I open up the last stitch a little bit so I can see where I'm going and proceed. So it's nice to keep these stitches loose while you're seaming so that you can see where you've come from and where you're going, and then every so often you stop and you pull the seam closed. But remember, we're picking up a V on the top, an A on the bottom, And once you have your first one established on the edge, really all we're doing is inserting the needle in the hole that the yarn came out of and scooping up the next two little legs, or full stitch. And we're doing this just above the bound off edge at the bottom. So, just below the bound off edge here, and just above the bound off edge here. And that's how we get the seam to look nice and neat. Keep working that seam until you get to the last stitch. Here I am. I'm at my very last stitch on the neck shoulder piece. I'm going to pick up the last V there, and then I'm going to pick up the final A on the back. Certainly there's more on the back, but that's part of our back neck. I'm now going to pull tight and make sure that my seam has closed up. Once I feel good about this seam, which I do, it's lovely, I'm going to just leave the yarn here. Later on, I will weave that in. I like to leave my tails to the end for two reasons. Number one, it's not my favorite job to do, so I like to leave it till the end so that I am not doing it all throughout the project. And number two is that if I need to undo the sweater for some reason, it's much easier to do that before the tail is woven in than after. After you've finished your first shoulder seam, you're going to turn your sweater pieces around so that you can work from right to left, and you're going to seam the other shoulder in exactly the same way. So you'll take 3 times the width of yarn approximately and pick up an A and a V and an A and a V till you get to the end. My shoulders have been seamed together, and you can see this is the back neck here. Here's the front neck that has a little bit of a curve. This is the front of my sweater and the back of my sweater. I'm going to start picking up over here, so I need to turn the sweater around. I'm going to put all the tails towards the inside of the sweater. They don't need to be in the way right now. And I have my working yarn and my knitting needle. I'm going to begin at the back right shoulder of the sweater. Right here is the back right shoulder of the sweater. I'm going to hold the yarn, the working yarn, in my hands that I'm comfortable knitting with. So in this case I'll show English style knitting first, and then I'll show continental style. But what I'm going to do is go to the seam, find my seam, and insert my needle into the very first V. So those are those stitches that we were seaming underneath, but in this case we're going into the one that looks like a little letter V, and sometimes I look down to find it. So I can see these nice little V's here. I'm going into the topmost one that's just beneath the bound off edge. So I'm pushing my needle right into that V. I'm going to wrap my working yarn around the needle just like I would for a knit stitch, and then I'm bringing that new stitch to the front of the work. So what's on my needle right now is the stitch that I just picked up. Now I'm going to do that with the next stitch. So I'm finding the very next V. So notice I'm not going into every single hole because that would double the number of stitches here. I'm only going into the ones that look like little letter V's, or every other hole, if that helps you visualize it. I'm going to insert my needle into that stitch, grab the working yarn, wrap around the needle for knit, and bring the new stitch through to the front. So this was the stitch that I just wrapped. In here, in the fabric, wrap the yarn around, pop the new stitch through. So we're picking up one stitch for every stitch here. For every V, we are picking up one stitch. And again, we're going below the bound off edge. We're not going into the bound off edge. We're going into the last row beneath the bound off edge. So that's how you pick up English style, where you wrap the yarn around the right hand needle with your right hand. If you are a continental knitter, you can pick up continental style by holding the yarn in your left hand, inserting your needle in, wrapping the yarn around the needle, and bringing it through. So it's just like a knit stitch, with the exception that we are knitting into our fabric instead of knitting into stitches on the left hand needle. So we're going into every V across the row. Some of them are easier to see than others. There are numbers written in the pattern for this section, so you have a goal in mind of how many you should have here. But essentially, if you're picking up one stitch for every stitch that's available from seam to seam, you will likely have the number of stitches that the pattern calls for. So we're inserting our needle into every stitch, making a new stitch on the right hand needle, and then bringing it through to the front. So across the back neck we have a straight line. Sometimes patterns are different. This one I wanted to keep as simple as possible. So the back is just a straight line. We're picking up straight across that line until we get to the shoulder seam, which I am approaching. So once you've picked up those stitches, you'll be ready now to come down the side of the neck, which is a little bit different because we're not dealing with bound off stitches anymore. We're dealing with edges of the work. So if you need to, pause the video here, finish picking up across the back neck, and then join me for the front neck. For the front neck, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we are not picking up on bound off edges right here. We're picking up on the side of the work now. And depending on what size you're knitting and which type of yarn you're using, there are many different numbers available in the pattern to you. The basic idea here is that for this straight piece, so from here until we get to our very first bound off stitch, which is here for the front neck, you have to pick up a certain number of stitches. So what you're going to be doing is going into the side of the fabric, stabbing your needle in or pushing that needle in, wrapping the yarn for knit, and bringing a new stitch through. And you're going to be skipping rows occasionally. So our goal is to stay in the same row going down so that we're not jumping all over the place with the knitting needle and making a jagged line. We're going in the same column of stitches, but every so often we're going to skip one. So I picked up two back to back, and then I skipped a space. Then I picked up one right here. I'm going into my next space, wrapping the yarn, picking it up. There's two. I'm going to skip a space, pick up one, pick up two in a row, and then skip a space. Sometimes I pick up three in a row and then I skip a space. Sometimes it's four in a row and I pick up space and then I skip a space. It depends how many stitches you need to pick up in that section of the fabric. So just keep in mind you want to stay in a straight line as you go, and you're picking up in every single hole but occasionally skipping one so that you can get the number of stitches you need there. Now our fabric has sort of changed again because we've got these bound off stitches, and actually this is not one I thought it was, but it's not. Now we have these little stair steps along the front neck. And what these stair steps are different rows of bound off stitches, much like we had across the back neck. So as I go across these, I'm going to walk down the stairs. I'm all the way up here right now, but I see my bound off edge right here. I'm going to come downstairs and pick up the V. Go into the V and pick up a stitch. Then on that same stair step, there's another V. I'm inserting my needle, wrapping my yarn for knit, and bringing that needle up to the front. And then I notice here I'm at another stair step, so I'm jumping down. The key with the stair steps is avoid the big hole. Do not go into the big holes that are between the stair steps. They're everywhere between steps. They're there because we've turned the work around and you work a row back, and so there are 2 rows between every stair step, and we want to avoid going into it. All we're picking up across the stairs are the stitches that were bound off. So you'll notice I'm in this column here. My next column is down here. Happens to be downstairs. I go in and I pick up a stitch. In, pick up a stitch. So you'll notice I'm in this column here. I scoop over one, in, pick up a stitch. It really makes a nice difference. It makes a big difference where you pick up on the neckline. Let's see, so here's one. With the knit and purl texture, it can be a little bit harder to see your V's sometimes. So just do your best, and remember, don't go into any big holes. It only makes them bigger. Okay, so I've picked up a stitch there. Now I'm jumping down the stair again to right here. And you can see that underneath each one of these stitches that I've picked up, I do have a column of stitches that grows out from under it, a column of V's. Avoid the tails. Okay, so we're picking up straight across, and anytime we get to a stair step, we either walk up the stair or down the stair. On this side of the neck, I was walking down the steps, but I'm approaching this side where I'll be walking up the steps. So here we go. I'm ready for the last stitch on the lower stair, and then here's my column. I jump over a column and come up the stairs. Again, not into the space between the stairs. That does not look attractive. If you've accidentally picked up in there and you're coming around your first round and you notice, you could knit 2 together right at that spot to try to close it up. All right, here we go. Picking up this one, and now I'm ready to climb up the stairs again. So you can see the difference in height. So I'm in this column, I'm jumping over. That's how you deal with the stair steps. And then, lo and behold, I'm back here on this straight vertical portion of the neck where it was worked in rows with no bound off stitches. So I'm going to sort of turn the work a little bit, and I'm going to pick up my ratio on the other side was 2 stitches and skip a space. 1, 2, and skip. 1, 2, skip. 1, 2, and skip, and 1 and 2. Lovely. So finish picking up and pause the video if you need to, because I'll talk about what happens next. We've picked up all the way around our neckline, and you're going to count your stitches and just take a note of it. If you have an even number for this pattern, if the pattern called for 88 stitches and you have 90, that's fine. If it called for 88 stitches and you have 86, that's also fine. You want an even number of stitches that's close to what I recommended in the pattern, okay? If it's within 2 or 4 stitches, that's fine. If you have an odd number of stitches, what I'd recommend is that as you work your first round, somewhere you either decrease 1 or increase 1 stitch to get to an even number, because we need an even number to make this stitch pattern work out. If you feel better increasing or decreasing a number of stitches in order to get to the number that I recommended in the pickup, that's fine too. All right, so We've picked up, our right side was facing. We are now going to place a marker onto the right hand needle, and we're going to join the work in the round. So up until now, our whole sweater has been worked back and forth. At this point, we're going to be working in the round, which means we go from our last stitch picked up, so the last stitch of this round, right over to the very first stitch of the round and begin knitting there. And here we are never turning the work. So we're always working stitch 1 through, let's say I have 100 here, 1 through 100, 1 through 100, 1 through 100. And we're working around and around, following the directions in the pattern for your size and yarn weight. I've seamed the shoulders, picked up and knit the neckline of this lovely sweater, and now it's time to sew the sleeves on. What we're going to do here is open up the sweater so it's laying flat. So here's my shoulder seam. It's a little hard to see with the texture. There it is. This sweater is a drop shoulder. So my plan here is to set the sleeve into the side of the sweater in a straight line. We're going to do that by measuring down from the shoulder seam the location that we want this sleeve to end. So the pattern says that. If your pattern does not say that, if you're following a different pattern and using this video to help you seam that sweater, that's fine. What you're going to do is measure across the top of your sleeve, and you're going to take half of that amount. So in this case I have 13 inches. I'm going to measure down half of that amount, 6.5 inches, from my seam and place a marker in the fabric on the side of the sweater. And then on the other side, measuring from the seam, 6.5 inches, this is where I'm putting my other marker. So this 13 inches right here is where I am setting in the sleeve. We're going to use our finishing yarn again, and in this case I'm going to take about 3 full spans of my arms. So I'm going to pull this hand way out, and I'm stretching this one across once, twice, 3 times. It's a lot of yarn that we're taking here, but I'm going to be using this yarn to seam the sleeve into here and then seam the side and sleeve seams. I'm going to put the yarn onto my tapestry needle, and then I'm going to find the center stitch of my sleeve. And you can do that by starting in the middle of the cuff and following your way up. My personal preference is to fold the sleeve in half, like so, and find the fold line. So right here is my center stitch. And in this case, I have a bound off edge on the top of the sleeve. So I'm going to be picking up the A that's underneath it. All right, so I'm not going into the bound off edge. This is just like our shoulder seam on the sleeve where I have a bound off edge. So I'm picking up a stitch here, and I'm bringing my needle through, and I'm going to leave about half of my yarn out. So this amount of yarn is half, and this amount of yarn is half. So I have half waiting here to work the other side. Now that I've grabbed my center stitch on the sleeve, I'm going to start working my side seam up here on the shoulder. And right now my stitches on this piece of fabric are laying on their side. Here they were sitting upright because they're just underneath the bound off edge. So these are stitches that you would see on your needle. Here the stitches are laying on their side. This is the edge of the work. All right, so we're dealing with rows here. And of course we have this beautiful texture. So we want to find a line between the first stitch and the second stitch, and that's where we're going to seam, where we're going to pick up our stitches to seam. So I'm going to dive in here right by the seam and scoop up 1 bar. And bring my yarn through. Again, my pieces, just like the shoulder seam, are laying flat with right sides facing. Now I'm coming back to my sleeve. I'm diving in the hole that the yarn came out of and scooping up a stitch, and then bringing that yarn through. Here I'm going to dive in where the yarn came out and scoop up one bar or one row of the knitting, one stitch here. So far I've taken single stitches on the sleeve and single rows on the body of the sweater. The problem with taking single rows too frequently is that the gauges don't match up from stitches to rows. So every third pass, I'm going to actually take two rows. So I took a single row, now I'm going to take 2 rows. Then I'm going to dive in, grab a stitch, single row, 1 stitch, 1 row. And you have to open this up a little bit to stay in the same line. Don't be afraid to stretch your knits open a little bit. There's a single stitch, and now we've taken single, single, so my next pass is a double. This is to help make sure that we have the right ratio of stitches to rows as we're seaming, so that our seam doesn't pucker, that our sleeve isn't stretched out or pushed into too small of a space. We want our seam to be nice and flat. So I've taken single, here's 1 stitch looped around this yarn, single, and now I'm taking another double. So you dive in the hole the yarn is coming out of, and you pick up in a straight line the rows that you need. So a stitch on the sleeve, a row on the body, stitch on the sleeve always, and a single row on the body, and a stitch on the sleeve, and now 2 rows on the body. All right, and just as we did on the shoulder, I'm keeping this loose for about 2 inches or so. This went beyond that, and then you can pull the yarn tight to close the seam up. I did that for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's good to close the seam up, but number 2, now I want to assess. Do I like the rate at which I'm taking those double rows, or do I feel like maybe I need to stretch the sleeve wider, or is it fitting nicely to the marker? So far it's fitting nicely, I think. Maybe I'll stop again right here and reassess. If your sleeve is pulling like this far, it needs to stretch out some more, maybe you would alternate 1 row, 2 rows, 1 row, 2 rows. Whereas if your sleeve was like this, you might take single row, single row, single row, then a double. So more frequently, fewer rows here to kind of help everything even out. That's why setting in sleeves are called setting in a sleeve, because you have to get it to fit in that position. So again, I'm going back to the ratio that I was using, which was 4 rows to every 3 stitches. And sometimes I vary it. Sometimes I'll do 5 rows to 4 stitches. It depends on the piece. And another good reason for using contrasting yarn, as I'm doing here, is that if you need to rip out that seam because all of a sudden you get to here and the pieces are just completely off, it's much easier to rip. Okay, so I just took a single and a single. I'm ready for the double. And I can tell because I've got my little stitch wrapped around just 1 and 1. Now it's here on 2. Let me show you that. But when in doubt, just take a double. If you've forgotten your pattern, just take a double. And looking at this now, I'm going to pull tight to close the seam. Looking at this, I can see that my sleeve is starting to fall short of that marker. So I'm going to switch now to single, double, single, double, single, double, always to the 1 stitch here. So I'm loosening up, double, to a stitch, and then a single to a stitch, and a double and a stitch. This might not be enough to do it. This happens frequently. This will happen when we're finishing. Double. I'm thinking this won't do it. I could keep going and prove it to you. I guess I will, because this might be what happens to you, that you get there and you realize, oh no, my sleeve didn't match up. Right, here we go. I'm off by, I don't know, 4 rows maybe here. So depending on how far you're off, it does not have to be perfection where your very last stitch matches here at the marker, because this is all done based on measurements, and knitting is flexible fabric, but I feel like I'm just a little shy there. So what I'm going to do is find in here, back a little bit where I had the finishing yarn. I'm going to locate it right there. So I'm back towards that center point now, and I'm going to pull out the finishing yarn. This is the sign of a good seam, actually, if you can pull out your finishing yarn, boop, and open it up, okay? And then I'm going to put that back on my needle, and I'm going to start that new ratio now. That new ratio is 3 rows to every 2 stitches, which means double row, single row, double row, whoop, to a stitch, single row, to a stitch, double row, to a stitch, single row, to a stitch. Okay. The good news is, once you've done this half of the sleeve, oop, that should have been a double. Once you've done this half of the sleeve, the other ones go much more quickly because you've cracked the code on what those ratios need to be. So they go much more quickly because you don't goof up and have to undo. Now here I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3 stitches left and maybe 6 rows. I'm going to start taking doubles for the remainder, just to get this really close. Alright, so the last couple times I took 2 rows on each pass here. Okay. Now I tend to go pretty far when I seam before pulling, and that's because I feel confident that I'm not backing up and making any knots. Until you get to the point where you're not making knots and accidentally going backward, I would suggest pulling every inch or 2. Okay. So there we go. I've gotten that half of the sleeve done. We have 2 sleeves, so there are 4 quarters to put on. So we've done 1 quarter. What I'm going to do now is turn the sweater around. Since I'm right-handed, I like to seam from right to left. And now I'm going to go in this direction using this yarn that had been waiting here for us. So I'm going to thread that yarn onto my tapestry needle, and I'm going to follow the pattern I laid out right here, which was single, single, double, single, single, double, single, single, double, single, single, double on the body side until I get to about the halfway point. Then it's single, double, single, double, single, double, and then double, double, double at the end. Always to 1 stitch on the sleeve. And now that our sleeve is on top of the work here, we're actually going to be picking up V's in the sleeve instead of an A. The way to remember that is your stitch should always be pointing towards the seam. So right now my yarn is on the sleeve, so I'm going to pop right over here into the body of the sweater and grab my first row. Then I'm going into my next stitch on the sleeve and my next row on the body of the sweater. stitch, and 2 rows. Okay, so we're following that map that we laid out on the last quarter of sleeve seaming. I'm a little bit before the halfway point. That's okay. I'm going to start now with my alternate pattern, which is the single double. I just feel like it's time. So single, always to a stitch from the sleeve, and then double. And here we are towards the end. I'm going to start just taking doubles now. Although for whatever reason, probably because maybe that wasn't the true center of my sleeve, for whatever reason this is matching up pretty well. Again, it's fabric, it's a little flexible. You can be as precise as you want to be, just like all things in knitting, right? You can fudge a little, or you can go the perfectionist route. With seaming, I think we're allowed to fudge a little bit. And here we go, I'm at the end now. And last stitch. After I've finished the seam, I usually loosen it up a little bit by just giving a gentle tug on these outer edges, just to make sure that that seam is nice and flexible. Since again, this is fabric, we want it to be stretchy and soft and pliable. We don't want to feel like we're being held in firmly by any of our seams. All right, so now that we have the first sleeve done, we will repeat that process on the other side. So marking out your halfway points from the seam, starting to set in the sleeve using that same ratio that we had used on the other side, on that other sleeve, to work that. So you're going to work it exactly the same. We've set in our sleeves to the shoulders of the sweater, and now it's time to seam the sleeves and side seams. So I'm going to fold my sweater like so at the shoulders so that the front and the back are touching and that the two sides of the sleeve here are touching. And I'm going to start by seaming my sleeve because I think that will be easiest for you to see, because it's stockinette stitch. All right, and if you recall, we had these two exceptionally long pieces of yarn sitting here at the underarm. That's what we had used to set in the sleeve, and it was a very long piece of yarn. That was intentional because now we have two pieces of yarn and two seams to make. So we're going to be seaming the sleeve and we're going to be seaming the body, and each one gets a strand of yarn. So I'm going to thread that strand of yarn onto my tapestry needle. You'll see here I have removed the stitch markers at the underarm, and my yarn is coming right here from the top edge, so I'll begin on the bottom. What I'm going to do is use my left hand fingers to open up the edge of the fabric. So with stockinette stitch, it curls, and this was lightly blocked, so blocking does not stop a curl. All right, there's nothing to do to stop a curl other than seam your piece together. So we have to embrace that curl and say, come on and open up for us, please, by putting your fingers underneath the fabric and opening it. Same goes for this side. You have to open up and flatten out the fabric. When we are seaming, we're going to be picking up the rows, which are these little bars, in between the very first stitch of the edge and the second stitch. So in this first clean looking column is where we're going. So I'm going to begin by scooping up a bar on this side of the fabric, and then uncurling the edge on the top and scooping up a bar there as well. Then I'm going to go into the same hole my yarn came out of on the bottom. I've uncurled my fabric and opened it up a little bit, and I'm going to dive in and scoop up 2 bars. Same thing, I'm opening up the fabric on this side, diving in, scooping up 2 bars in that same line, going straight down. So fingers uncurl the fabric, I open it up a little bit, dive in the same hole my yarn's coming out of, and bring it through. Uncurl, open it up, dive in, and come through. So 2 bars on each side. We're taking our rows here at a 2:2 ratio, and we shouldn't have to do anything more than that on our sleeve since this is one piece of fabric. We know that our rows match up from one side to the other. If you were kind to yourself and worked your increases 1 or 2 stitches away from the edge, this will be nice and smooth the whole way down because your increases will be within the fabric and won't distort the look of these bars at the edge of the work. If you have to play with it a little, if you weren't as kind to yourself with that or thoughtful about what would be coming up with the finishing, I would recommend just doing your best and making sure when you get to those increases that you try as hard as you can to make sure that those increases match up from one side to the other. So they're sort of checkpoints for you, and I'm using them here that way myself. So here's an increase, and here's an increase, and with my seam, they're pretty much lined up with one another. So I know I'm on the right track with this seam. So you're going to do what we did with all the other seams. You pull tight every few inches, loosen up your last stitch, and then zip ahead to the end of the seam. Here I am approaching the cuff of the sweater, and at this point the stitch pattern changes from stockinette to that extended seed stitch from the body of the sweater. So I'm just going to take it slow here, and I'm going to take 1 bar from this side and 1 from this. So I'm just going to slow it down in terms of how many rows I take at once. So instead of the sleeve portion, the stockinette portion of the sleeve where I was taking 2 bars and 2 bars consistently, here I'm just taking single bar to single bar, because I find that the slowing down and taking less fabric from each side helps the stitches match up a little bit better, and helps the transition from one pattern stitch into the other in terms of stockinette to the double seed. And so I'm going all the way to the very bottom corner on each side, and I'm going to then gently pull as we've been doing, and there is my sleeve seam. I'm going to leave these tails here just as I did on my shoulders to make sure that the sweater fits the way I want before I commit my seam. I would say 99% of the time everything is fine and I don't need to undo a seam, but I like to just play it safe. It's my insurance policy. Now that I've finished the sleeve seam, I'm going to turn the sweater so that I am looking here at the side seam. I have this strand of yarn waiting for me at the underarm. I'm going to put it onto my tapestry needle and begin seaming the same way that I did when I started the sleeve, except now I do have some texture to contend with. Here I'm going to begin with a single bar just by the sleeve and underarm, and a single bar here. Once I have those first bars established, then I'm going to switch over to a 2-bar or a 2-row. That one felt loose, so I just took one. Here we go. Taking 2 rows at a time from this side and 2 rows from this side. And I'm going to continue down the side of the fabric. The one thing that I am cognizant of is that I want a full stitch right here. So I see a full V. That to me indicates that I'm in the correct positioning. And that's me being very precise about this. If this is your first time seaming, if you can see that full stitch there, the full V, and you can stay just either above it on the bottom or below it on top, and help that be your guide for the row that you're seaming in, then that's great. If you're having trouble seeing that, that's okay. Uncurl and do your best. Insert the needle into the same hole the yarn is coming out of and scoop up 2 bars in a row as smoothly as you can. There shouldn't be any other strands, fabric, crisscrossing anything on here. It's just the 2 ladders that we're scooping up. So that's your indicator if you are picking up the, something that shouldn't be there. All right. The next thing that we need to consider as we're seaming this is whether or not we have the same number of rows on the front and the back that will match up. So for example, if we had a discrepancy like this, I would take a single bar that many times throughout the sweater till I matched them up. So I would take double, 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 single, double, 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 single, and so forth. So occasionally taking one less row on this side as I'm seaming on the shorter side to help stretch this out to get it to match the longer side. You can count the rows if you want to see if you have the exact number on each side, or you can just check it visually to see. It seems like I'm on the right track here, that my rows match up for the most part, but I might assess that again at maybe like the 2/3 point. When I get to about here, I'll take another peek, and at that point, I will count the rows to compare. I'd say I'm about at the 2/3 mark right here. So let's look closely at this and see how many rows I've got on each side. We're in a unique position with this pattern because we have these 3-row repetitions where the stitches shift. So we almost have these little stripes of texture, I'll call them. So I'm going to count those stripes of texture, each one representing 3 rows from this side, from the top, and from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And then on the bottom, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Oh, so that worked out. They match. However, let's say you had 12 on this side and 14 on this side. That would mean that you have 6 fewer rows, 6 less rows up here, and 6 more on this side. They're off. There's a discrepancy of 6. So 6 times you would take a single row from the shorter side as you're going. So here again, I'm just doing my 2 to 2. If I needed to adjust the length, I would take a single row every so often like this from the shorter side. Again, I lucked out. I will say it doesn't always happen that way. So just this time it did, of course. I'm just going to finish seaming all the way to the end. Towards the end, I'll reassess, recount, see if I want to take a single bar anywhere just to get things a little more even. And probably for the last 6 rows or so anyway, I'll take single bars just to slow it down, so I'm not scooping up as much fabric in one scoop. Now this is feeling a little longer for some reason, so I'm going to take a single bar from the short side and a double and a double. You don't want to put all your single rows right next to one another because then you'll get a pucker. So we're going to spread it out a little bit, but I'm taking double, 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 and then another single. And what that does is it just spreads this out a little more in a very subtle way to help the two sides match up once you get to the bottom. And again, I said towards the bottom I'm going to start taking single rows consistently. So let's do that. Single, 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 single. Looks like I'm getting there, almost at the corner on the bottom. Here's the corner, and on the top, here's the corner. And I'm just going to pull that yarn, and again, leave that until I've done all the seams and tried the sweater on. So the sweater fit, I love it. I can now weave in my tails. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to close the last stitch to the first stitch of the bound off edge on the neckline. So I have my yarn attached to the tapestry needle. Here's my last bound off stitch on the left. I'm going to come underneath the stitch that's on the right, the first bound off stitch. And you can see right there I've already made half of a stitch. I'm now going to take my tapestry needle and put it straight down into the very last bound off stitch, and just like that I have recreated the missing link. And then I'm going to weave this tail into the garter ridges on the inside of the collar and then snip it. So that's the neckline. Now let's look at the inside of the sweater. Right here I have two tails. One of them was from working the shoulder seam, this beige tail, and the other was from the pickup. So I'm taking the beige tail and I'm going to slide it over to the one that I had done the pickup with, to the working yarn. I'm then going to put both tails onto my tapestry needle, make sure they're about the same length, and then into this seamed ridge I am going to weave the two tails together to close it up. So my tails are zigging and zagging into the seam for about an inch or an inch and a half. And then after I've gone for that amount in one direction, I'm just going to come backwards for 1, 2 passes just to lock that yarn into place, and then I'm going to trim it. So any tail that's near a seam, that's what you will do with it. Let's move on to a sleeve seam. At the end of a sleeve seam here, and I'll show you what you can do there. So with the right side facing, my first step is going to be to make sure I've closed up that edge nicely. So I'm going to go into one corner end, then into the other to make sure that the bottom of the sleeve is closed and connected. Then I'm going to trim these two tails to match. I'm going to turn the sleeve inside out. So you can do this, of course, with the full sweater inside out. That's fine. And then I'm going to weave in the same way I did at the shoulder seam. In and out of the seam, just grazing the seam. I'm not going deep into the sweater because that would put tails at the front of my work. I just want to graze underneath the seam and lock everything in, and then come backwards for a stitch or 2 to make sure that that yarn won't budge if the seam gets pulled. And that's how you weave in your tails. Stick them into all the seams. When you're done weaving in the tails and seaming your sweater, you can lay it out on a towel, spritz it with water, and tap all the pieces into place. So you'll put the collar the way that you want it, spritz it, tap it into place, steam or tap down the seams, the shoulders, the sides, just to get everything nice and comfortable and smooth. And you can even pin your sweater to the shape that you want, but basically a little bit of blocking will go a long way with this sweater just to smooth out the seams and the stitches. I hope this was helpful for you. Please hit that subscribe button if you liked the video. Happy knitting!